Hello Rome, and hello Manchester and Madrid and Brasov. This is the first time I've ever done this. And I apologize that I'm not speaking in Italian or in Spanish or Romanian, but we do have our co-authors on the reports here, some of them at least, and I encourage you to talk to them. I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you to Preya for this beautiful room, and to all of the partners for organizing this event. I am coming from Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace. We are an NGO based in Washington, D.C. And essentially our mission is to work to conserve forests and other ecosystems through innovative market-based mechanisms and environmental markets. And the Ecosystem Marketplace Initiative is a
Hola, perdonad, la presentación ha empezado ya. Estamos en streaming con Roma. Si podéis sentaros y así la escuchamos.
You don't have to pay for it, and we do that because we believe that markets need transparency to work. They need good information for people to make good decisions. And I'm here to talk to you today about some work that we have been doing in collaboration with the University of Padova and with EDIFOR. As part of this larger ECOSTAR project, one of the goals was to kind of develop this knowledge base on entrepreneurship and innovation in this field of nature-based business, which you'll hear more about today. And there are sort of three pieces to that part of the work. An innovation report looking at factors influencing innovation and entrepreneurship in nature-based initiatives, some case studies on business models that have been very innovative, and you can see these at the ECOSTAR Hub website, and I encourage you to take a look. I'm talking today about 3 market outlook reports, which offer sort of a high-level review of market activity in Europe and some direction and opportunities. Our scope is voluntary carbon, watershed investments, and biodiversity offsets and compensation. This is just sort of a piece of, I think, what we mean when we talk about nature-based business, but they are some of the more dominant models. We collected all of our data through confidential surveys of project developers, credit retailers, brokers, and other market actors last year, and as well as some interviews and desk research. And I do want to emphasize that our methodology is conservative. We only report what we can confirm with a primary source. So there's probably more than I'm going to talk about here. We know there is, but we prefer to be conservative rather than to overestimate what's happening. And I do want to thank our authors and our many contributing authors. This was a lot of work to put together, and we really couldn't have done it without everyone here. Louder? Okay. So first I'll talk about the voluntary carbon report. I think probably everyone in this room knows what a carbon offset is. But just as a review, and because I like this graphic, carbon offsets, I mean quantified emissions reductions. We measure them in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And as you can see in this graphic here, project developers do need to complete a pretty intensive set of steps from project inception and design through to validation, verification, and issuance. In terms of the voluntary carbon offset market, I'm going to talk today about 2 main groups, offsets that are developed anywhere in the world but sold by European organizations, and then offsets developed from projects in Europe, also sold by European organizations. As you can see, the first group is much larger. There are a lot of European companies that act as credit brokers and retailers, mainly in the United Kingdom, and the offsets that they are selling are mainly coming from Indonesia, excuse me, and Turkey. And we estimate that market value to be at least 129 million euro a year, selling at an average of around €3 a ton. It's actually a little higher for project developers and retailers and a little lower for brokers. For projects that are based in Europe, the market is much smaller, but as you can see, the average credit price is much higher, more than €15 a ton. And these projects, I should add also, are mainly in the United Kingdom. They've got the Woodland Carbon Code, which has been very supportive, as well as in Italy. And there are a few in Germany and the Netherlands as well. In terms of project type, afforestation and reforestation have the largest market share, both in that group of offset space worldwide and in Europe. You'll notice that wind actually transacts more volume globally, but the prices are so much lower than forest projects. And that's true globally and in Europe. Forest projects tend to sell for a lot more, and that's, I think, because buyers really appreciate the multiple benefits that you get with a forest carbon offset as opposed to wind, for example. Oh, I forgot I had that animation. In terms of buyers, I think that the important things to emphasize here are globally, buyers tend to be in the energy sector, but in Europe, more of them are in the transportation sector. In Europe, also, more buyers of European offsets tend to be end users, and there are quite a lot of new buyers every year in the market. And what that says to us is that there's probably potential for growth there. There are companies out there who, you know, they want to buy offsets, but they want to buy offsets from within Europe. In terms of opportunities and outlook, I'll go through this very quickly, and I would encourage you to take a look at our reports. But I think that one of the real challenges in the voluntary carbon market is this question after Paris of whether there's going to be a problem of double counting of offsets by both the end users and the countries that have set these national targets. And I think one way around that is thinking, instead of carbon offsets, can you market climate impacts? If your buyers are interested in sort of a broader set of benefits from forest projects, do they really need an offset, or do they just want to buy the climate benefits from a forest? And we already see actually that there are there are not so many forest carbon offset projects in Europe, but there are a lot of tree planting projects, and there are a lot of people willing to pay for those. And so we actually see very low rates of verification against third-party standards in Europe because buyers are less interested in verification against the standard. It's expensive. It's not necessarily what they're the most interested in. They're interested in the forest. Plan B, barring that, is this question of nesting projects into landscape level emissions reduction programs, sort of rolling them up to the national level. And that's something that we'll see. It's been talked about a lot. But I think coming back to this issue of multiple benefits, there's some interesting things happening with integrating climate and forest certification standards. The FSC's Ecosystem Services Certification, I think, is the most famous example of that. As well as whether you can align indicators from forests with the Sustainable Development Goals and figure out how to monetize those benefits. We also are seeing a lot of interest from companies in addressing deforestation in their supply chain and supporting forest projects as part of that effort. Again, you're not necessarily creating an offset. And this last issue of SRI and conservation finance. We did a report last year on the state of investment and private investment in conservation, and we found that there were about $3 billion in finance sitting waiting for bankable projects. And so there's a lot of money out there waiting for good investments. There's interest. So moving from carbon to water, we did our second report looked at the state of watershed investment, by which I mean payments and investments in green infrastructure, and green infrastructure being those hydrological benefits that you get from healthy landscapes. And you can think of there being sort of a spectrum from engineered water infrastructure through to the, the mountains and the glaciers, the forests, the wetlands that provide us with a lot of hydrological benefits. And so the scope of this report is quite broad, and it feels like it changes every time we do it because people keep thinking of new ways to invest in watersheds and in hydrological services. But this model shows you the basic mechanism. You have a buyer, downstream, maybe a water company, and upstream there are landholders managing the land, and the buyer pays the landholders to keep their forests standing or to restore their wetlands, and that delivers clean water, reliable water supplies, flood risk mitigation downstream. And we looked at 3 categories here, sort of user-driven watershed investments, agro-environmental subsidies, mainly under the Common Agricultural Policy, and water quality offsets. These are those 3 in terms of their value, their total area, and median program value in area. And I'm going to talk mainly about user-driven watershed investments. I think they're kind of the most innovative and certainly a little more common than water quality offsets. And I apologize that the font on this table has gotten messed up. At any rate, we see user-driven watershed investments transacting at least 40 million euro a year. The average project size is just under €1 million and covers 3,500 hectares. In terms of what these projects do, they're mainly on private lands and mainly focused on agricultural or pastoral sustainable management and grassland conservation. We see interest in forest restoration or enhancement or conservation, particularly where there's a water supply issue. Agricultural interventions tend to focus more on water quality. Who pays? Water companies, water utilities, both public and private, and to a lesser extent, the private sector and cities and national governments. I do want to note in Europe, there's actually a lot more private sector activity. Businesses are much more willing to pay for this here than anywhere else in the world. I think the Vitel case study in France is very famous, but there are actually a lot more examples like that. And why do they pay? And this is, I think this is a little bit, watershed investments are a little bit unique in that there are a lot of different reasons depending on who the buyer is. The public sector tends to be more driven by climate risk and natural disasters, as well as some of the social co-benefits, can you support rural economies? The private sector is interested in corporate social responsibility and their supply chain. And then water utilities tend to be driven more by immediate physical risks in their basins and also regulatory concerns, mainly the Water Framework Directive. And again, this may be very obvious, but I think it's important in that you need to think about what each of these sectors needs in structuring your pitch to them. In terms of outlook and opportunities, we see the Water Framework Directive really driving basin approaches. And while that doesn't necessarily mean that the Water Framework Directive is going to obligate watershed investment, it does support stakeholder networks, and it does support developing basin-level scientific knowledge, and both of those are very important. We're seeing a lot of interest at the EU level and national level in policy supports for green infrastructure and investment in natural infrastructure. I've got a few listed here. Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, and Spain are all moving forward on policy, and we talk about this more in the report. In the UK, the water regulator there, Ofwat, has been quite supportive in recent years of catchment-based approaches, and they have built a really impressive body of knowledge and experience there, and it will be interesting to see what happens after the Brexit And then also this comment I made before, Europe has been a leader in corporate water stewardship and private water risk management. And I do expect that to grow. There's a European water stewardship standard that's been piloted in several countries, and my understanding is that Nestle has committed to rolling that out at a number of sites. Finally, biodiversity, offsets, and compensation. So as Davide pointed out, these are not true PES in the sense that we are mainly looking at compliance-driven biodiversity offsets and compensation under the Birds and Habitats Directive and national policies. And here, this gets, I apologize for throwing a lot of jargon at you, but here we're looking at one-off offsets that are implemented directly by the party that has impacts to biodiversity. Alternatively, if you've got impacts to biodiversity, you can pay a fee to a financial compensation fund, or you can buy an offset credit from a habitat bank. And so we did look at all three of those mechanisms, and we looked at them within the context of the mitigation hierarchy, which means that if you have negative impacts to species or habitats, best practice is to first avoid those negative impacts as much as you can. Then you minimize them as much as you can. You restore and rehabilitate as much as you can. And then only then, if there are remaining negative residual impacts, you offset. And this is a figure showing kind of the state of offsets and compensation in Europe as of 2015. About a little over 70,000 hectares of projects, restoration, preservation, and habitat creation projects have been implemented, and another 47,000 hectares are on the way. One-off offsets are sort of the best established in Europe. In a lot of countries, they're your only option. But we did see that banking has a lot of new projects in development, and mainly driven by the private sector. These projects tend to be focused on marine and coastal areas and grasslands. That is because the buyers tend to be coming from transportation and shipping and other infrastructure projects, port development, rail lines, transmission lines for energy. Impacts, since a primary driver are EU level, the Birds and Habitats Directives, these impacts do tend to be to Natura 2000 sites and mainly on public lands. And we also did ask how long these projects are committed to protecting habitat. And the good news is long-term. More than 40,000 hectares. You know, the conservation actions are in place for at least 50 years. So these are long-term projects or permanent projects. And I mentioned this before, the transportation sector, energy sector, local government are major buyers. The energy and shipping, public shipping, transportation sectors tend to have very large projects. The average project size is 15,000 hectares for energy generation. And last slide, outlook and opportunities here. You know, the European Commission, thank you, is pursuing a no net loss initiative. There was a public consultation where there was a lot of ambivalence about offsetting, concerns about how effective it would be, particularly in implementation. But a more recent study, an impact assessment study, suggested that to achieve no net loss, some form of mandatory offsetting measures are probably going to be necessary. And so I think the question is, you know, how do we make sure that they're implemented correctly? How do we make sure that these are effective projects? One issue in putting together this report that we ran into is there's not very much transparency in this sector. It's very, very hard to get information about these projects, which I think is a little concerning. You know, insofar as that there is this public question of how effective are these and how well are these being implemented. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed a little bit. It varies by country, but it's very difficult compared to water, to carbon, to get information about these projects. The natural capital financing facility, moving on, is an interesting development that they're watching. They have a 125 million euro budget for bankable projects that are making a business case for nature-based approaches. They signed their first loan agreement just a month or two ago with a group based in the Netherlands that is working on restoring Natura 2000 sites. And there's a lot of interest in habitat banking in the private sector. There are pilots that we've seen in France, Spain, the Netherlands, and the UK. I think that there's still work to do in terms of clear regulatory supports for habitat banking and equivalence across the different mitigation methods. In theory, banking is a promising approach in terms of reaching true no net loss, because when you buy bank credit, those restoration actions have already been implemented, right? So there's less implementation risk, and in theory, there's no temporal loss. But you do need strong regulatory signals in favor of it. And I've got this one more bullet point. In Germany, actually, it's quite well established, but mainly publicly managed. And we are seeing signs that the private sector there as well is interested in entering the banking space a bit more. And that was a very, very quick run through of a lot of text. So please visit our website, take a look at the reports. If you have questions in Italian, ask Alessandro or Cole. And thank you.
Grazie mille a